Look, we'll get into the more general issues about protectionism and the end of globalization, question mark, in a minute. But I think what's happening and the directives coming from the White House is such a perfect example of what this panel is about. I'd just like to stay on this just for a few more minutes. Minister, is protectionism always a short-term aim, and does it always come at the expense of the longer-term gain? Donald Trump hasn't said it in public, but apparently in private, during his first term, he was asked about the problem of the US national debt. And his answer was, I don't care because I'll be dead by the time it's a problem. And apparently that's also his approach to the climate crisis. So is this protectionism coming from the White House a short-term fix which is going to hurt America in the longer term in terms of how it grows?
It's not a fix. It's apparently a quick fix, but it's fundamentally flawed, as Professor has very clearly stated. Look, protectionism is nothing new. If you look at post-global financial crisis, the number of annual trade restrictions have gone up dramatically. In fact, like last year, there were over 3,200 trade restrictions. That is almost 11 times higher than what it was pre-global financial crisis. So this has been a trend, but what we have seen over the past week or two is clearly a new level. This goes beyond, some protectionist measures, trade restrictions. This goes into something, an all-out trade war. So that's really worrisome, because if you go back again, if you look at 20 years to global financial crisis, global annual trade growth was 2 times world real GDP growth rate. So in a way, trade was the engine of growth. Mm-hmm. Now that engine has been slow. So if you look at post-global financial crisis, global trade growth barely kept up with real GDP, global GDP growth. So that's no longer really one of the kind of like a strong engine. But I think the way things are now, if current state of affairs is sustained, we may end up actually protectionism dragging global growth. It is not only growth, it's really, there are many, additional fallouts from this type of policies.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So the answer to your question, this is not a fix. This is a fundamentally flawed, policy perspective. Obviously, countries have choice. They always have a choice. But we would rather, see world moving back to rule-based, multilateral framework, where everyone benefits. I think I agree with Professor. Over 1 billion people since 1990s have been lifted out of poverty, predominantly in Asia. I'm talking about absolute poverty here. And that's largely thanks to, trade and growth associated with that trade. So it is worrisome that we are now experimenting policies that may actually reverse some of these gains, which I think were very important. 1 billion people out of absolute poverty cannot be underestimated. It's quite significant. Now, admittedly, trade do cause geographic dislocations, but the solution is not protectionism. The solution lies more internal sound policies, structural remedies, but also you can deploy tax policy incentives and other things to address, dislocations in regions caused by, global trade openness. So it's not a level, but protectionism will create more inequalities. It will create bigger problems. Already you've got significant headwinds for global growth. Aging population, high global indebtedness, impending climate crisis. So protectionism is going to be yet another big blow to long-term growth outlook. And that's why growth is barely, sustained at 3%. I think the risk is that we will move to a new era where per capita GDP growth will almost disappear if we continue down this path.
Really interesting what you say about protectionism having fallout in other sectors, and we will get on to that, about how it might affect cooperation on the climate crisis, global health, et cetera, But let's use one country as a particular example about how a nation can react to protectionism. So we have the US tariffs, which in 90 days will come into effect beyond the 10% that Donald Trump has placed. Let's take two rich countries. UK and Singapore will stay at 10%. Bangladesh and Botswana will both go up to 37%. Laos will be 48%. Syria will be 41%. Lesotho in southern Africa will be 50%. In 2023, the US exported to Lesotho $7.33 million worth of goods. Lesotho in that same year exported to the United States $228 million. The US GDP per capita in 2023 was $82.8 thousand per person. In Lesotho, it was $916. Gentlemen, how does a country like Lesotho deal with the protectionism coming from the US? Minister?
Well, look, protectionism is an external shock, meaning it's not a decision by, the counterparty. It's essentially, so how do you deal with it? I guess you focus on regional integration, as an antidote of protectionism. So regional connectivity, regional integration would be one way forward. So, instead of globalization on a big scale, you focus on how you can deepen and broaden your ties with your immediate neighborhood or countries that are still willing to entertain rule-based trade. So I think that's the only way. Again, this is a major shock for many countries. I think global supply chains are going to suffer. This will lead to, already, I think the risk is that capital will be misallocated. Take us, take Turkey, for example. We are the world's second largest of white goods exporter. We need chips, basic ones, nothing sophisticated. We're not talking about 4 nanometers. We're talking about 30, 40, 70 nanometers. If we're worried that countries are not going to supply that, even though it may not be the most efficient way, we may have to go into a very large capex to see if we could produce them. We are good at something. Other countries are better at something. So we would rather trade. And this is a very simple, economics, theory. Everybody benefits. So I don't think, X country or Y country, there's not much they can do except to look at, ways in which they could mitigate the fallout from not being able to sell goods to the United States.